Hi! Welcome to this part of my review featuring the Wicked Ones role-playing game. This is the role-playing game where the player characters play as the bad guys, the rulers of the dungeon, the orcs, trolls, goblins, lizardmen. If you haven't seen the other parts of this review, please check out the playlist in the description below. This time we are going to take a look at the cycle of play. Gameplay focuses around a steady cycle of play that simulates life in a dungeon, progressing through 4 linear phases: lurking, calamity, raiding, and blowback. While these phases are set, there is also room to step outside of them and set up interesting scenes that come up during play, without it needing to be related to that phase. The phases are there to help simulate dungeon life, but if you want to play some other scene, if you want to roleplay through some other situation, you can also do that. And it is because of this structure that the Wicked Ones role-playing game functions pretty well with just 3 to 4 hours of game time, which usually gets you through 3 or 4 phases. Since Calamity and Blowback depend on how the roll goes, it's impossible to know how long they might take, however. Don't feel like you have to cram all of the phases into a single session. While it's pretty satisfying to open up a session with lurking, do some downtime actions, deal with small calamities, go on a raid, then wrap it up by defending your dungeon, that's a lot of stuff to pack into a session. The game usually runs better and everyone has more fun when you have room to breathe in. Take your time, set up cool scenes just for the fun, and roleplay through them. Now let's take a look at each of these different phases. First we have lurking. From the relative safety of the dungeon, behind your traps and creatures, you bide your time and build up your defenses while looking for the next opportunity to strike. The lurking phase covers the everyday life within your dungeon. You go through recovery in order to heal yourself, you count the loot you hauled in, you enjoy some revelry, and work on downtime projects to improve the dungeon. So when it comes to counting loot, as you return to your dungeon from raiding, you haul back any loot you gathered and heft it onto the horde. Each player then makes a loot roll to find out what you do with it. This is a time to count your gold, find cool stuff in the loot, and enjoy some revelry which fills your dark heart with glee. When you get an item, you pull something useful from the loot that could have been found on the last raid. It has to make sense within that context. When it comes to revelry, you choose a type of revelry at character creation, of course, your player character's favorite way to let off some steam. The available types of revelry are listed, though you can also make up your own if none of those fit. So maybe you indulge in drinking, gambling, in violence, it could be anything. Now concerning downtime, after the revelry calms down, you have some time to spend building up your dungeon, preparing for your next raid, or working on something devilish of your own design. These are called Downtime Projects. You can do things like build traps, craft potions, work on rituals, or break a prisoner's spirit. You can take downtime actions to work on any of the downtime projects. So maybe you want to brew something, to build something, torture some prisoners, craft some sort of device. Now concerning Calamity, dungeons are messy conglomerations of minions pressed into service, creatures lurking in their confines, and a maze of tunnels throughout. They are filled with traps and tricks in a haphazard fashion. Things are bound to go wrong eventually. After each lurking phase, the game master rolls to see if your dungeon managed to avoid any calamity during the phase. The number of dice rolled is determined by the amount of grumbling coming from the denizens of your dungeon. The key to minimizing grumbling in your dungeon is to follow dungeon logic. A dungeon that makes sense to minions makes them feel content. The more you think like a monster, the less calamity will befall your dungeon. However, calamity can't be resisted, but you can start a scene to deal with any fallout from it. Let's talk about dungeon logic. Dungeons might not make a lot of sense to humans, but they make perfect sense to their denizens. This is called dungeon logic, and basically reinforces how a fantasy dungeon operates like a fantasy dungeon should. Normal levels of malcontent is the norm for your denizens, always finding something to complain about. There are 5 factors which figure into dungeon logic. These factors are atmosphere, growth, hierarchy, loot and revelry, and worthy masters. Atmosphere determines how content your denizens are on a day-to-day basis. They want your dungeon to make sense, feel like a dungeon, and have at least some rooms that they can enjoy. Growth is always on the minds of a dungeon's denizens. They yearn for power as much as their masters do, because belonging to a strong dungeon means greater raids and more revelry. When it comes to hierarchy, this is of the utmost importance within a dungeon. There's a reason the first few areas of a dungeon are filled with weaklings. Powerful monsters, such as upgraded minions, think it's beneath them to face the enemy first. Now, loot and revelry are an effective way of keeping your monsters in line. Making sure you go out of your way to increase loot rolls helps keep grumbling down. Now, when it comes to worthy masters, they demand loyalty from their minions, whether it be out of respect or fear. You have to present a strong front, and any chinks in that armor quickly become apparent to those below you. Give them a reason to serve you by following through on your master plan and building a strong reputation as evil overlords among those on the surface. Now let's talk about the types of Calamity. The severity of the Calamity is determined by the Calamity roll. The game master can come up with something fitting on their own, or you could use tables to determine the category of the Calamity. So there could be a dungeon invasion, a denizen could be in trouble, or perhaps there is outside interference. There are minor calamities, which result in mishaps within your dungeon, small things that are a bother but don't present an enormous challenge. There are also major calamities, which result in big events that have a major impact on the dungeon. They are a serious setback that requires your immediate attention and puts a lot of pressure on the dungeon. Some examples of calamities that could result from the table could be townsfolk with pitchforks that show up to dispatch you. They are woefully unprepared. Or maybe a dark faction arrives at the dungeon demanding an immediate audience. Or perhaps there is a small earthquake that breaks a potion or concussion in the player character's possession. Or maybe a minion pack betrays a player character, ambushing them in an incredibly vulnerable position. Perhaps you obtain some major calamity results, like a ghost possessing a player character intent on revenge. Who must the player hunt? Perhaps gnomish engineers come through a wall with their tunnel boring machine, ready to fight. Or maybe a shared or steady supply that you have is spoiled, stolen, or runs out completely. Now let's talk about raiding. No dungeon is self-sufficient. You need resources from outside, whether that be warm bodies standing between you and adventurers, riches to fuel your horde, or materials to build more rooms. You leave your dungeon to further your nefarious master plan, deal with factions, and loot the riches of the overworld. Raiding consists of figuring out your goal, choosing a target, setting a plan, then launching the raid itself. After a small amount of planning, raids let you skip directly to the action in progress. You work together to terrorize civilized lands, looting your way along as you work towards your objective. Let's talk about launching a raid. Dungeon monsters are at a distinct disadvantage when it comes to knowledge of the world around them. The overworld is too dangerous to scout, so you're going to be striking out blind for the most part. There are only a few specific methods to scout targets, such as calling abilities, dungeon rooms, torturing prisoners, and flashbacks. However, even if the player characters don't know much about the world, the players do, and they can use that information to judge what will be worthwhile or fun to raid. As covered in the flow of information section, it's expected for the players to act on knowledge that their player characters may not have, and for the game master to freely share all but the most secretive of information related to the plotline. Raids let you skip directly into a high-stakes, high-reward scene. To help set up a scene, you need to give the game master the following key pieces of information. You need a goal, you need a target, a plan, and details. Because you are trying to accomplish something, you are trying to hit someone. You want to go about doing things in a particular way. and you need to get things started. Your first step is figuring out why you're raiding the surface. What's your goal? What do you want to accomplish? Maybe you want to acquire materials for a specific room. Maybe you want to further the steps of your plan. Perhaps you want to press other monsters into service as minions. Now, concerning factions and targets, factions are much larger than your dungeon, and the two aren't directly comparable. You don't target factions, you find targets to hit within those factions that fall under their protection. How much there is to gain, but also how tough a target is to raid, is determined by how the faction tier or your target compares to your dungeons. Higher tier than you means that they have many circumstances towards position and effect working in their favor. When they are at the same tier of your dungeon, means that they only have circumstances working for them that are strong points of the faction they belong to or the specific nature of the target. A faction that has a lower tier compared to your dungeon means they usually don't have much working in their favor. So you need to take advantage of that. Let's talk about setting the raid scene. After you know your target and your goal, you announce them to the game master. Each raid has 3 parts: the approach, the goal, and the getaway. On a normal raid, you will only be zooming into one of these scenes, with the players or game master briefly narrating the others. You could consider these raids as heists in a certain way. Now let's talk about the plan and details. Once the target has been set, the game master tells you what type of scene the raid will likely focus on, and some details about what it might look like some riders running you down on the road, or you starting on the outskirts of town. Once you have this information, you need to work together to come up with a plan. Plans, of course, are basic outlines of how you're going to deal with the scene you zoom into when it comes to the raid. So basically, you choose one plan and then answer 2 or 3 questions posed by the game master. Maybe you want to carry out an ambush, some stealth operation, negotiations, assault, or perhaps trickery. Raiding is a way to cut to the good stuff. It provides a framework for players and the game master to do some rapid world building on the fly, come up with a few interesting details, help paint the scene, and then skip right to the action. Let's talk about loot. While out on a raid, monsters are always on the lookout for loot. Looting is the unstated primary purpose of every raid. So no matter the goal of the raid, you are assumed to also be looting in the background, which guarantees you at least something each time. You can then go out of your way to secure more. Throughout a raid, you build a pool of dice that represents the loot you gather and roll it later back at your dungeon to pull out gold and items out of the loot. Or maybe you could spend it on enjoying yourself and earning some dark hearts. Good loot requires going out of your way to acquire it. You've already snagged the easy to grab loot just lying around. That's all wrapped up in the base roll. Any extra sources of loot are going to be guarded, hidden, or just plain difficult to haul away. You could take out an adventurer, which might mean killing them, but it could also mean capturing them or making them run away. It's assumed that you have time to loot their body or snag something they dropped. So when it comes to loot results, maybe you find a massive flag at the top of a flagpole, but it's in plain view of the archers. Perhaps there are gilded seashells lining the high shelves of the temple to the sea goddess, but they are glued down. Maybe you find a large crystal, but it's incredibly fragile to both touch and sound. Maybe you encounter a large golden harp, but it's incredibly heavy. Each raid lasts as long as it takes, whether it's the approach, the goal, or the getaway, though it's usually quite clear when the action dies down. At other times, it might not be so clear. The easy answer here is that a raid is finished in different fashions, depending on the scenario. Sometimes raid scenes end incredibly quickly. A great engagement roll, followed by a few successes or maybe a critical on well-chosen actions, can wrap things up very fast. Now, concerning the aftermath of raids, apart from the benefits to your dungeon and the blowback you might suffer, raids have whatever other effects on the fiction that seem logical. Blowback isn't the only way for factions to move in response to raids. Often traveled roads may close down, or perhaps outposts are abandoned, making your raid targets shrink up. The Game Master should mark down where each raid happens and what session it happens in on the faction sheet. Now, when it comes to pillaging, it is a massive endeavor which grows your horde by bringing large amounts of gold and resources back into your dungeon. When pillaging, loot is the goal and you have to hit a significant target with a multi-part plan. If you manage to pull it off, it increases your dungeon tier and the faction you hit loses a tier. Pillaging a target requires 2 raids. First, you must go on an initial setup raid that creates an advantage or opening that you can leverage or follow through with the pillaging raid against a faction's center of power or a major source of wealth. Once you decide to go pillaging, you need to search for a faction to hit and get an idea in mind for what your pillaging raid might be. After you decide your primary target, you search for a smaller target and set that as a goal that can help create an advantage on the pillaging raid. This target can be from your primary target's faction or even from another faction if it makes sense. You could get some complex plans out of this. Now, immediately after the setup of the raid and the following loot roll, you dive right into the pillaging raid. There is no time for recovery or returning to the dungeon in between. You have to strike while the iron is hot, else you lose the advantage you've created. Finishing this raid should require either gathering a substantial amount of good loot or securing one very valuable item. Now, when it comes to blowback, raiding the overworld is bound to draw some attention. Before your dungeon appeared, the region was in relative balance, but the added pressure from your attacks starts to throw things into chaos. Your incursions will catch up to you sooner or later, and you're going to suffer some blowback. You're definitely not welcome on the surface, and while a few monster tribes may be friendly with your dungeon, the vast majority of surface dwellers would love nothing more than to see you dead. Each raid plan has a guideline that you have to follow if you want to minimize blowback. Some amount of failure is built into the plan, giving a little leeway in following it. The exact nature of blowback and where it comes from is up to the Game Master. It can immediately follow the roll or can be pocketed by the Game Master and brought out later, at a more impactful or convenient time. Blowback often results in zooming in to a scene in progress, like being ambushed as you return to your dungeon. At other times, it might result in something immediate that doesn't require a scene, like a player character losing gold. There are 2 types of blowback. Minor blowback results in an inconvenience, but one that you're likely equipped to ignore or handle. Major blowback results in an immediately pressing concern that must be dealt with, risking the success of your latest raid or even your lives. You have tables to determine these random blowbacks. Maybe there is a dungeon invasion. Maybe there are difficulties during your journeys. Maybe you end up ambushed or captured. Sometimes blowback or calamity is rolled, but the timing just isn't right for it. Maybe the session is about to draw to a close, or you want to keep the focus on other events. Whatever the reason, the Game Master can always just pocket blowback or calamity, marking it on the Game Master sheet and bringing it into play later. Some examples of minor blowback could be: you see a dead deer with an arrow in it. The wound is fresh and you hear the hunters coming. Maybe the roads in this area now have riders with dogs patrolling them. Or maybe a famous adventuring crew arrives in the region and leaves warning signs for you. Some examples of major blowback include a dark faction that is sick of you in their hunting grounds and decides to attack you during your next raid. Maybe 1 or 2 of you are taken and imprisoned in a small border garrison. Now you are the bait. Perhaps a friendship with a faction breaks as they feel somehow slighted due to your latest raid. Or maybe a light-aligned dragon roasts the copse of trees you were hiding in, and then it comes in for a snack. Now let me give you an example of gameplay featuring an assault. With the werewolf terrorizing the countryside for several full moons and an invasion defeated, the player characters turn their thoughts to finishing their master plan. On the next full moon, it'll be time to strike at the town and drive them from the region. The Game Master speaks. Alright, Downtime. What are you all up to? Ulrot, wanna get us started? Ulrot, the Orc Brute, speaks.
I need new minions, so I head out to that orc tribe again and spend the gold there. I'm just re-recruiting the same kind of raiders as before. When we get back to the dungeon, I pay them another gold to smash together the battering ram.
Ulrot rolls 2 dice of smash for his minions and gets a mixed result. Ulrot speaks.
Just barely enough to finish off that clock. They spend way too long putting the wheels on it. They put one on, then move to the next, while the first wheel falls off. Sometimes rolling down the hill. This just kinda repeats for a while.
The Game Master speaks. How about your downtime action? Ulrot continues.
Ah, right. I head into the prison to pay that monk a visit. I want to torture him into telling us what he knows about the werewolf. I guess I'll smash some fingers until he starts talking.
The Game Master speaks. Yeah, just remember that without a torture chamber, you don't have dominant position. Ulrot rolls 3 dice of smash and gets a mixed result. Ulrot speaks.
Okay, I think this is pretty straightforward and won't go into detail here, but it involves broken bones, not as much information as I'd like. I'm losing my temper. What does he tell me?
The Game Master speaks. I'm using some pocketed mirror blowback here. He tells you that they have the dire wolf caged in town. An augurer identified it as the source of the curse and believes it'll lure in the werewolf. Then suddenly, fearing he might say too much, the monk then bites his own tongue off. Crag, the kobold shaman, speaks.
Damn it! Well, that gives me an idea though. I'm going to contact the direwolves pack and try to get them to run rampant through the town with us. I want to invoke Wildheart to do this.
The Game Master speaks. Getting the pack to do your bidding is a tier 3 spell again. Crag rolls 1 die of invoke and gets a failure. Crag continues.
Screw that! I'm gonna risk it and roll again without dominant position. I think as I approach them, they are obviously on edge, growling. I put up my hands, non-threatening, and explain what's going on.
Crag rerolls 1 die of invoke and gets a mixed result. The Game Master speaks. The wolves leap at you, and you're sure you're about to get ripped to shreds, but another wolf backs them off. It scares the hell out of you, and you take shock to guts, but you are alive and they are listening. Crag speaks.
Strike the town on the next full moon, but wait until you see fire. That's the signal. I then back slowly away.
Slem, the Slissic Shadow, speaks.
Well, we're not gonna be needing this tongueless monk anymore. I drag him out of his cell and haul him into the greenery. The plants hungrily snap at him, but I have a certain plant in mind. Fire blossoms. I throw the monk in front of them and head off. They scourge him, then start feasting. I come back a bit later to pick some fire bombs.
The Game Master speaks. He's a tier 2 adventurer, so tier 2 fire bombs work. You can harvest 2, though one of them's volatile with a super short fuse. Slem speaks.
Sounds good. Give them to Ulrot. Here, you'll be needing this.
Ulrot speaks.
Nah, screw that. I want to power struggle. I toss it back and threaten you. No. I think it's gotta be you riding that battering ram.
Slem speaks.
I tried to trick you. What are you talking about? You are heavier. It's gonna need a weight to get going fast enough down that hill.
The Game Master speaks. Let's see some rolls. Olrot rolls 2 dice of threaten and gets a failure. Slem rolls 1 die of trick and gets a mixed result. Slem speaks.
Don't worry, you're gonna be fine. With that short fuse, remember to count to 2, not 3, before tossing it. That's the key. Now, my downtime.
And that concludes this part of the review. As you can see, the process is quite involved, but because of the good structure, it's very easy to center yourself on a particular action. All of the group is going to be participating, carrying out those phases, and they're going to be making those plans, targeting factions, places, and people belonging to those factions. Or as I stated earlier, maybe you want a more complex operation. Perhaps you want to pit a faction against another faction, so you carry out separate attacks or maneuvers so that they clash with each other, and you attack a location linked to one of those 2 factions because they are distracted in their own ongoing battle. I really like it how this game encourages you to roleplay different aspects of the dungeon lifestyle. Well, thanks for watching this part of the review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending drive-thru RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. In the next part of the review, we are going to talk about the sandbox aspect of the game. Once again, thank you and see you later.